Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. We're just doing some last minute preparations here, but I want to thank everybody for logging in. We'll go right to the top of the hour. We've got about a few seconds before, but again, hope everybody had a long weekend, a nice one if you had President's Day off. And again, we want to welcome everybody. So there we go. I'll go ahead and get started. Good day, everybody. I want to thank you guys for stepping in here and welcome to our webinar. It's CMMC Assessment Readiness, Documentation and Evidence Simplified. My name is Will Bussey. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Alluvionic. I'm going to moderate this session. And during this session, we're going to explore some insights into the whole CMMC assessment readiness process. We're going to work in our objectives here are going to help you understand the critical role that documentation, artifacts, and evidence has in the assessment process. Hopefully you'll be able to pull out here some best practices for gathering and maintaining evidence and to meet those compliance standards during the process. We'll also explore some strategies for ensuring accurate, complete, and accessible documentation throughout the process. That way you will have a good background and a good foundation on the streamlining your process here. One of the things that I like to point out is, this process can feel a little bit overwhelming. There is a lot to do, but with the right approach, the right documentation, artifacts, and evidence, it can make all the difference in how successful your assessment can go. Alluvionic is coming from this, from a place of being in the depth of it. We're in the process of going through ours right now. So we're seeing some of these pitfalls firsthand. And so basically, before we get started, we've got a couple of housekeeping rules, excuse me. We want to make sure everybody is muted. If you have any questions along the way, go ahead and put them into the Q&A section. We're going to have some time at the end to chat and kind of address all your questions and everything that you guys might need. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists. And again, I'm Will Bussey, Director of Business Development here at Alluvionic. With us today, it's Bobby Padilla. He is our Information Security Director. He's a Cyber AB certified CMMC professional. And I have Dariush Bodhi from CohnReznick. He is their Cybersecurity Director. And they are a Cyber AB authorized certified third-party assessment organization. That's a mouthful, isn't it, on a Monday, Tuesday. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
So first, I'd like to start out real quick. I know most of our attendees are probably familiar with the CMMC process, but Bobby, could you give us a quick overview just to kind of refresh everybody?
Sure. So just take a minute. Obviously, if you're here attending today, you certainly have a vested interest in the CMMC program. So just wanted to kind of highlight a couple key slides. It's just kind of the what, the why, and the how of CMMC. So CMMC is a pre-award assessment framework designed to ensure that the defense contractors have implemented the necessary cybersecurity protections to safeguard the Department of Defense's sensitive information. It's going to consist of a assessment methodology that's going to evaluate whether a prospective defense contractor is going to meet the required cybersecurity controls before they can be awarded a future DoD contract. Why is it important? Well, the goal of CMMC is to ultimately strengthen the cybersecurity posture of the defense industrial base to ensure our defense contractors are effectively protecting the DoD sensitive information, such as controlled unclassified information, or CUI, or federal contract information, also referred to as FCI. So how does the CMMC work? So all defense contractors and their subcontractors must demonstrate compliance with the applicable NIST 800-171 security requirements before a future contract award. Compliance is either going to be shown through a self-assessment process for a limited number of defense contractors, or most commonly an independent third-party assessment certification, those will apply to contracts involving CUI. And ultimately, the commercial off the shelf or COTS procurements are excluded from CMMC requirements. The next slide. So what is CMMC applicability or apply to? So it's going to apply to all DoD solicitations and contracts where a defense contractor or a subcontractor will process, store, or transmit FCI or CUI on its own contractor unclassified information systems. CMMC requirements must be met for all new DoD solicitations issued after the full CMMC implementation. Any new DoD procurement instruments to include contracts, task orders, and delivery orders. Any existing contracts when there's an option period that's exercised, it's going to require contractors to demonstrate their ongoing compliance with CMMC. And finally, contractors also must comply with those flow down requirements for their subcontractors to ensure CMMC compliance is being applied at all tiers of the supply chain. Next slide. So the CMMC clause that's going to be effective once the final CFR is published or its final is going to be DFAR 7021. Most of you are familiar with DFAR 7012. DFAR 7021 is going to be the mechanism in future DoD contracts that will require the CMMC certification. As you see there, it's going to require contractors and subcontractors to develop RFIs and RFPs, or requests for information and requests for proposals to update artifacts and deliverables. You will either, as I said before, have to conduct a self-assessment or a full third-party assessment by a certified third-party assessment organization. There's also going to be an annual affirmation requirement that must be entered into SPRS system. And again, as I mentioned, those slowdown requirements are still required for 7021 as they are for DFAR 7012. Next slide. And the final slide is just kind of depicting the CMMC levels. Today we're going to focus primarily on CMMC level 2, which is the 110 security requirements aligned with NIST 800-171 revision 2. As I mentioned, the majority of our CMMC level 2 organizations that are going to require certification will require a third-party assessment certification that will be good for 3 years. And then that, as I said before, there will be also an annual affirmation required. Any questions?
Thanks, Bobby. Appreciate that background. Again, you know, with so much information out there, it's a good, you know, I like to start out with giving everybody a background, kind of see where we currently stand. So we appreciate that. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to our panelists, and I'm going to start with a quick question. We'll come out of the gate here. Dariush, I'm going to start with you. And what would you say the most critical areas an organization should prioritize when preparing for a CMMC Level 2 assessment?
Thank you, Will. The most important areas for CMMC Level 2, and indeed there is one document that is the most important document, and that's your system security plan. If you look at the SPRS scoring mechanism, the fact that if you don't have an SSP, that stops the assessment. And if your SSP is not complete, that also stops the assessment. And no matter how good you have implemented all the other controls, the fact that your SSP is incomplete or not present, there is no score. There is no 5-point, 1.3-point score for SSP. It's all or nothing. They are stopping the assessment, and they are categorizing in the SPRS that no decision has been made. So you are not going to even have an SPRS score. So that's the number one. That's the number one requirement, is the SSP. The number 2 requirement, although it's not, those are not controls in the version 2 of 800.171, which is a deprecated version, but the DoD has decided to stick with it, is that you need to have all your policies and procedures that support the implementation of the 110 controls also ready and mentioned in the SSP, that you have those policies and procedures in place. Those are, if somebody wants to read NIST documentation, those are called NFOs. That's NIST parlance of things that are so obvious that they don't need to have put it in control. Of course, in version 3, they put it back as controls because they decided that regular people don't understand NIST parlance. So that's the other thing. I have a client right now that went through a DeepCAC moderate audit, which was only DeepCAC moderate means they only look at documentation because they didn't have some of their policies and procedures correctly correct. They failed the audit and they got a negative score. So this is very important. Now, policy is not a policy until it's approved. Procedures don't need to get approved. SSP needs to be approved. So having an SSP without some senior person signing the SSP and approving the SSP, that doesn't count. So please have your policies and your SSP get approved. And that's the key. And of course, the availability of the evidence, but we can discuss that later on in the discussion.
Bobby, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think just, I mean, obviously, as he said, that the SSP is really critical, the most critical document. But I think really just even before you start there, really just identifying what is going to be evaluated. So kind of reviewing your contracts and determining your compliance requirements, right? So as I said before, some organizations may only require a level 1 certification. Which if they're only handling federal contract information. So really just first and foremost, starting by reviewing your contracts and determining what requirements you have. That's going to be really critical to get started.
But just coming out of the gate, reviewing those contracts, that could determine your path or your directions and where you need to go within the SSP and things like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would say to include your investment, right? So your level of effort and potential cost.
And it's very important when reviewing the contract to see if it includes DFARS clause 7012. It's in the section of the contract that says clause included by reference. So then underneath it, you just see a list of those DFARS clauses without any explanation. Most companies ignore that section of the contract because they think it's just overhead, but that's where by signing that you have obligated yourself to safeguard controlled unclassified information. 7012, that is going to be rewritten as part of the proposed final rule CFR 48, which as Bobby said is going to introduce the 7021 clause, which forces people to abide by CMMC. They are also going to rewrite 7012 and other clauses to, again, align them with the new CMMC program. So if you have that in your contract, even if you haven't received CUI, you are obligated to safeguard CUI, and the DoD expects you that you have the infrastructure in place to receive CUI and to handle them in a secure manner.
So again, most people know this applies to all companies, large and small.
Correct.
And so they've got different obstacles, if you will, to kind of proceed on this process. What is a way that like a small or mid-sized business can effectively start their compliance journey? What would you guys say or recommend for that?
Is it for me, Phil?
Sure, Darius. I'm sorry. Yes.
Sure. Yeah. I can discuss.
It's for anybody, but hey.
Yeah, for small companies, there are two cases. Either they have directly contracted with the DoD or they are subcontractor to a prime contractor. Now, for those who are directly contracted with the DoD, of course, they know that they have to contract the CUI. For the smaller companies, actually, they have to evaluate and say, okay, a majority of my business with the DoD or 100% of my business is the DoD. So it's very simple decision that therefore I'm going to have set aside all my classified work that I'm doing. For my unclassified work, which is also DoD work, I have to abide by CMMC. So therefore, let me go ahead and implement the CMMC controls company-wide. For a company that is hybrid, that does some commercial work and some DoD work, then it's a matter of deciding where to implement the CMMC controls, and maybe the best solution for them is to have an enclave where it's hosted separately. Is it cloud hosted? It's the best solution. For example, all the big cloud service providers have no CMMC compliant enclaves. Microsoft has the GCC, the government community clouds at the various levels, the GCC, which is FedRAMP moderate, GCC high, which is FedRAMP high. AWS GovCloud, for example, is now available to the members of the DEEP. That's a FedRAMP high thing, or even is the Google Cloud is FedRAMP moderate. So all of those guys have geared up to be able to host the enclave on behalf of the members of the DEEP. So if I'm a small entity, that's what I'm doing. Now, lots of small entities as subcontractors, you are at the mercy of the prime. Some primes, they just flow down the requirements of CMMC without regard of what kind of data you receive, and they say if you want to continue to do business with me, you have to be CMMC level 2. Now, there are some forward-looking primes where they have established an enclave for their smaller subcontractors, and they invite those subcontractors into their own enclaves. And this way, you don't have to implement the enclave. Of course, then they probably they charge the subcontractor a fee for utilizing their enclave, but I think that's a negotiating position between the subcontractor and the contractor at the prime contractor at that point. But I've seen many cases that those guys have set up enclaves where they invite their subcontractor, sometimes free of charge, to collaborate with them within their enclave, because they understand that imposing that requirement onto the smaller subcontractors is not economical for them.
Well, that's interesting. Bobby, you've seen quite a bit. We've worked on some with our clients. What would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, so I certainly agree with his assessment. I think, I'll say it again, it starts certainly with understanding the requirements, and then kind of, as he mentioned, potentially an enclave is defining the scope of your assessment to determine what your boundary is going to consist of, whether it's a federal contract information or CUI, kind of defining the scope of your environment that's going to be applicable to the CMMC requirements. And then I think at that point, taking it a step forward and performing some sort of assessment. So if you have internal resources that understand the NIST frameworks well, you may be able to, perform a self-assessment accurately. If not, there's obviously lots of support out in the ecosystem, such as, registered practitioner organizations or other CMMC consultants. So just really having that assessment to really determine, once you've identified what your scope and your boundary is, to see what your strengths and weaknesses are in your compliance.
So even to take a step back before your SSP and everything, so you kind of want to see where you're at. You want to have that self-assessment and then start moving forward. Is that kind of what I'm hearing? All right, it's a good recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, obviously at some point we're talking about starting here. So
Yeah.
Understand your requirements, and then at some point you need to assess, right? And see how mature or immature your organization is when it comes to the full CMMC compliances. And we'll certainly get into documentation, as he said earlier. But just understanding the requirements is super important, as it's not just a technical control certification. There's a lot of documentation required. So obviously a third-party expert will have that experience and that knowledge, but it also can be done in-house as well.
Thanks. Bobby, I'm gonna keep the spotlight on you, because that was my next topic, was documentation. So what would you think the key components of strong documentation for a CMMC Level 2 compliance journey be? What would you recommend?
Well, it's going to certainly start with that system security plan. As you said, there's no assessment without a well-documented SSP. So that's going to be super important. But then also but also understanding what the aspects are, right? So it needs to include your information security boundaries, your system environment that you operate in, and then fully detail implementation details for not just the 110 NIST 800-171 security controls that we talked about earlier, but all 320 assessment objectives are required as well. So again, that would be something that would be reviewed by the third-party assessment team prior to an assessment being ever scheduled. And I believe if that was not fully documented accurately, that would probably be a showstopper as far as continuing with your assessment. So again, it's all about understanding the requirements there. I think you also need to have a documented plan of action and milestones. So after you've performed that self-assessment, if there are some weaknesses or gaps there, establishing a POEM that's going to identify those gaps and those planned remediation actions. Then also just ensuring that you have estimated completion dates and prioritize those efforts, and then a continuous improvement in progress towards full compliance using that plan of action and milestones or POEM as a guide.
Dariush, what are your thoughts?
So additional documentation, I agree with Bobby. Additional documentation here is it's your incident response plan, a tested incident response plan. Let me add that you have to test it at least once before the assessors come in. And you have to make sure that you have to have some other documents just to show that you have operationalized those controls, such as a vulnerability management plan, your continuous monitoring plan. And those documents, although not mandatory, you can just mention that in the SSP, how you are doing it. So those can be also part of your general policies and procedures, but those are requirement. Work from home policies, those kinds of things. Now, there is a new thing as part of the CFR 32 rule that has been devised by the DoD, and this is the operational plan of action. That's a new document, didn't exist before. The DoD just invented it because they realized that the way they define the POEM, they say, well, if your score is 110, a perfect score, then your POEM must be empty. But then somebody thought it through and says an empty POEM is not a realistic thing. But the way they defined it, they need an empty POEM. So they decided that there is going to be an operational plan of action where, for example, as part of your vulnerability management plan, you put in the OPA the new vulnerability, you do a vulnerability scan, the new vulnerability that you discover, you put it in the OPA, not the POEM. Because the POEM has to be empty, because if you are meeting the 110 controls. The POEM is reserved under the CMMC program. The POEM is reserved only for those tasks that are required to meet a control that you have been missing. So for example, let's say you are not putting distribution statements on all your documents. You have a POAM action that to add the distribution statements where applicable. So that thing would go into the POAM with somebody responsible with a deadline. But on the other hand, in your OPA, you say, vulnerability scan, you put your patch schedule, you put the schedule for your risk assessments and for your annual security assessment, et cetera, et cetera.
So with documentation playing such an important role in the process, what role do you think templates that a company can play in streamlining this process? And is there any kind of caveat of relying on templates for documentation?
Templates can be a starting point, but you cannot rely exclusively without, but you have to customize that template to your environment. And for example, a template that is CMMC compliant for incident response plan, you can download those templates that are available, but then you have to spend time customize it to your environment. Who is going to be your incident response team? What are the roles of your incident response team? For smaller organizations, the incident response team may include their managed service providers, or as the Department of Defense has renamed those the external service providers. So you have to make sure then, when you are testing the plan, the external service providers was participating in that test. Otherwise, the test is not valid because you said, well, as part of my incident response team, this section of the plan is the responsibility of the MSP. So you have to make sure the MSP representative is participating. So that may require you to actually amend your contract with your MSP to make sure, number one, that the MSP is aware of the role, and number two, they actually participate, without saying, hey, I don't have it in my statement of work or something like that. So there are things that you need to do for those kinds of things.
Bobby, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they can certainly save time, and they can create some standardization, but that customization is critical. And really so as you update that template and customize that template, it needs to reflect your actual security operations, right? Or how your organization operates, to match your, again, just kind of the real world implementation of, I think that's kind of what we've seen in some previous assessments, is the documentation, whether it's system security plan or policies, procedures, doesn't necessarily match, reality and what's actually going on down at the stakeholder or CUI user level during assessment interviews. So therefore, they're not matching the reality. So that's really important that occurs.
It sounds like that a templated document library could be a good asset for a company, but they just got to make sure everything is correct. All the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. That's kind of what I'm hearing, correct?
Yeah, just ultimately tailored toward your environment and your operations. Yes.
Great, perfect. So I'm going to move on to evidence, and I kind of want to get your thoughts. I'll start with you, Bobby. What would you say like good evidence for an assessment looks like, and maybe some of the best tools or practices for organizing that evidence for the assessment process?
So obviously well written, clear guidance, clear well written policies, procedures, and then again, kind of back to templates and things like that. They need to be aligned with the CMMC and NIST 800-171 controls. There's lots of other templates that you could find and with other frameworks. So obviously you want to make sure that they're aligned with this framework and this certification, that they're accurate. They again demonstrate your operational execution. The other part of that was, you said, what does good evidence look like? So you can certainly, that's from a policy procedural perspective, but obviously any other evidence such as screenshots or configuration settings, things like that, logs and reports, training requirements or training records for your employees for CUI handling training or insider threat training. Those are obviously requirements for CMMC, ensuring that you have collected those artifacts and evidence as well.
So remember, for each objective, and there are 320 objectives, you need 2 types of evidence. An evidence can be either a person that is getting interviewed, an artifact that is as Bobby said, either a screenshot, either a policy, or a screen share. So, for example, you share, your firewall configuration with the thing. Then there is a third item, which is a test, where the auditor, the assessor, can ask you to give them a population. They select a sample of the population, and then they go test a control to see if the control is effectively implemented.
Interesting. Okay, great. Thank you. Now I'm going to move on. Here's something I'm sure a lot of our attendees would like to hear, kind of some of the pitfalls and the challenges associated with this. So I'll start with you, Bobby, again. What would some common mistakes a company might make during a readiness effort, and what can they do to avoid those?
Well, so one common mistake is treating CMMC as a one-time good deal compliance effort. So maybe thinking that it's a kind of a check the box, or it's a paperwork drill. It's certainly far from that. So that's certainly one thing that would be certainly a major flaw or mistake. Incomplete or too generic or too broad of documentation, kind of back to like perhaps using templates and not customizing them. So another one is, I think, lack of leadership buy-in, right? And employee buy-in, but it certainly starts with the leadership team in the organization. That's really important, is ensuring that the leadership understands the level of effort that's required for this certification, and then ultimately having the employees follow that position.
Dariush, do you have any input on that?
Yeah, other pitfalls, and I can from experience, I can
You've
tell
seen
you,
it.
I've seen it. I've seen it at my clients. Not updating your poem in a timely fashion, whereby when the author of the SSP thinks the control has been met, and it has been met because they have implemented the item that was in the poem, but the poem document wasn't updated. They send the poem document to the assessors with the SSP, and then the SSP says the SSP deducted, let's say 3 points or 1 point or 5 points, depending on the control, on that control, and the set. But we implemented the control. It says, why do you have a poem item in your poem for that control? If that control is met, you shouldn't have a poem item. So please be very, very careful that when you are updating one document, all the related documents to that control has to be updated, because any discrepancy on that will cause you to fail. And that's especially between policy, procedure, and the SSP. You need to have the same message. So if the SSP says, hey, I'm bringing the screensaver after 15 minutes of inactivity, the policy says, I'm showing the screensaver gets turned on after 10 minutes of inactivity, then there is a discrepancy between SSP and policy that makes that control, you fail that control. So let's make sure that the SSP can be more strict than the policy, because you probably have, for example, let's say 30 minutes, because your policy applies to the whole organization, where the SSP only applies to your CUI section, your CUI system boundary and stuff like that. And therefore it can be more strict, but it cannot be less strict than your policy. So always make sure that whatever you put in the SSP, it's actually it's more strict than what you have in the policy. That's another area where, you know, the assessors play that. The other thing that you have to make sure is there are some things that are like really mandatory, and if you don't have it, then they are going to say, well, you know, you have not operationalized CMMC. As Bobby keeps saying, you cannot say this is a one time. A good example of that, over and over again, the incident response plan that I have looked at it, they have forgotten to include in the reporting section, you know, reporting back to the DoD. It's an easy thing within 72 hours, and that's in the DFARS rule. So guys, CMMC, you have to implement the stuff in NIST 800-171. But remember, where does the CMMC comes from? It comes from the DFARS rules. You have to make sure that you are complying with the DFARS rules. One of the DFARS rules, yes, within 72 hours, you have to report it back to the DoD. Where do you report it? Is deepnet.dod.mil. I have that email. I have it memorized. It has to be on your incident response reporting section. Number one item that I report to, external party that I report to, is the DoD, and I'm sending an email within 72 hours to that mailbox.
Interesting. What would you say, since CohnReznick is a C3PAO, what would you say is like one of the biggest challenges, you know, an organization presents to you when you're starting out a journey with them? How can they address these things up front?
As Bobby said, one of the biggest challenges is either their SSP is not complete, or that their system boundary has not been fully defined. They always say, well, we don't know, is this guy in, this guy that not in, and therefore they cannot produce an accurate inventory that is required before we can start the assessment. So that is why the Cyber AB has recognized that. And before the assessment, there is the pre-assessment phase of every assessment, where we are looking at the inventories and we validate with the client, okay, is this inventory accurate? We are going to look at this inventory and we are going to assess, you know, the 110 controls against the inventory that you have set. Now, if during the assessment, you know, somebody when I'm interviewing somebody, for example, and then somebody says, oh yeah, there is like 200 servers in that other location, and you know, I'm responsible for that, and I'm looking at the inventory, I don't see that 200 servers, then I immediately fail you because your inventory wasn't accurate. And there is a control, which is a 5-point control, is inventories have to be maintained, and then you are failing that control, so minus 5 points over there. And then because it's a 5-point control, then it doesn't matter, you know, how many other controls. Your score may be 105, but you still fail the assessment because you failed a 5-point control.
So again, it sounds like that attention to detail to make sure everything is in place.
Attention to detail, and then the biggest thing that I keep telling it's the assessment. Let's say Bobby is leading the assessment on behalf of Alluvionic as the single point of contact on the Alluvionic side, and I am the assessor. I'm coming to assess Alluvionic. Bobby has to think of himself as the defense attorney and I am the prosecutor. And then Bobby has to think any Alluvionic SME that I'm putting in front of Dariush to get interviewed, it's like a witness. So I have pre-interviewed that witness, so I won't get surprised by anything that guy says to Dariush, because this way there is no there is a smaller chance of that person selling something that causes, let's say, Alluvionic, for example, missing the assessment because somebody said something that Bobby wasn't aware of. So this is very important. Whenever I prepare people for an audit, for an assessment, DoD doesn't like when I use the word audit. So for an assessment is that take it seriously and take it as though prepare all the participants in the assessment that they should be singing from the same hymnal, like a choir. They should be prepped. They should be ready for that. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So in essence, how you used your legal analogy, when a big case is coming up, someone's going to go through a mock trial.
Exactly.
If we're doing an assessment, it's recommended you could do a mock assessment so you can see how you're going to go down that whole process. I like that.
Exactly.
Well, what would you give on a practical advice side, Bobby? I'll start with you. What would you kind of advice you give a company that's starting their readiness process? So I want to begin my journey today. What would you recommend?
So yeah, certainly never too late to begin your CMMC compliance journey. And ultimately, you want to start with a structured approach. That way, you don't have delays, so you can avoid those delays and any challenges. I mentioned earlier, starting with the gap assessment. After you've kind of defined your requirements, kind of identify your strengths and weaknesses. When you're ready to move forward, I would, as far as from a compliance or implementation or remediation, I would focus on some of those key security controls that are probably worth 5 points. So if you don't have multi-factor authentication, if you're not sufficiently limiting access to CUI from a principle of least privilege act perspective, certainly I would start there. Encryption, or ensuring you have encryption both in transit and at rest. So those are really strong areas as well. Ensuring you have strong documentation. We've taught, that's obviously the center of this discussion today. And then gaining that leadership buy-in, right? That's super important. And then ultimately training your workforce.
What do you think, Dariush? What would you give a recommendation to a company just starting the process?
Yeah, I agree with Bobby wholeheartedly. I would add that the first step is actually defining your system boundary. What are you getting assessed? So that Bobby said it at the beginning. That is the first step. What am I being assessed for? So here's the 10 contracts that have 7012 on it, and here's the infrastructure that supports those 10 contracts. So what is part of that infrastructure? Because sometimes you forget something. So for example, I had a client where that client at the headquarters, they exactly knew, this thing, and they run into one of the contracts. And then I was talking to the program manager for that contract, and I asked her, okay, so what are the locations that are supporting the contract? And he said, of course, the headquarters location, and we have a warehouse in Jacksonville. And literally, I saw the CISO says, warehouse in Jacksonville? I haven't heard about a warehouse in Jacksonville. So unbeknownst to the headquarters, that program manager needed a warehouse, rented a warehouse in Jacksonville, and nobody in the headquarters knew about the warehouse in Jacksonville. So that's and it was full of CUI. So that came as a surprise for them. So that's why, the step where you actually systematically go and define your system boundary is important, because it uncovers, number one, these like program specific stuff that probably the central headquarters may not be fully aware of, or may not know about it. Or shadow IT. You don't know, the program may have a whole shadow IT because the program is delivering, for example, software to the DoD. And they have a whole shadow IT, they have setups, a separate network and all those kinds of things. So those are the stuff that is very important to do. And then once okay, you agree, everybody agrees that this is the assessment boundary, this is what we are going to assess, then we can do like a gap assessment, which would be like a holistic gap assessment. And you make sure that, hey, that other shadow IT, they don't have any policies, procedures, and stuff like that. So let's fold those shadow IT into the central IT, for example, and then you get the businesses buy-in, because otherwise that business unit cannot continue to do business with the DoD.
It sounds like, going back to what Bobby said earlier, that it starts at the top, or it starts with leadership, as in to get buy-in from everybody to make sure, like the whole organization, because they're going to be having these changes are going to be made. So if we start at the top and have it come down and let everybody kind of get on board. So that's very interesting. So I'll go to some questions. We got some coming in now. If that's okay, we'll kind of transition into our audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, anybody, any thoughts or whatnot, feel free to put them in. I got a first one in. It says, and I'm guessing going back to our evidence, do the screenshots and reports require timestamps and dates?
Yes. The screenshots usually the way the screenshots work is not that you bring in an screenshots without having any context. Is that during an interview, the assessor asks you, okay, show me, for example, the group policy object in the Active Directory or Entra ID. So you bring up the group policy object, and then at that time they say, can you take a screenshot of this? And then you take the screenshot and you send it. You send it to the assessor. That's how the screenshots work. You cannot have the screenshots without that. The policies must be dated, and the date of approval is the date that the assessors are going to look at. The rule is that if it's more than a year old from the date of last approval, then the policy is not valid anymore, because the policies need to be reviewed, on an annual basis. And so if they look at, okay, it last got approved by the CISO or by the CIO or by the IT manager like 2 years ago, that's not valid. They wouldn't accept that policy as a valid policy.
So again, it comes back to, like we were saying earlier, this is not, like Bobby had referenced, this is not a one and done process. So it also, I guess, with that documentation and reporting, relies heavily on you also updating these things, as you had mentioned before. So that's an important time. Yes, I sent the screenshot in, there was a timestamp, good, I'm done. But no, you need to make sure that as you update these poems and other processes, you need to, again, document them, if that's correct.
That is correct. So for example, if you are sending a screenshot in of, a firewall that is, let's say, 2 months old, they're going to ask you to, again, send a screenshot that is like maybe from yesterday or from today or something like that, because in 2 months, that firewall may have changed or something like that.
Bobby, have you seen things of that when we've gone through the process, or people, that require asking about the documentation or the evidence on those pieces of evidence?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it's going to be up to the assessor, the lead assessor. But as Arush said, it's perhaps certain evidence they may accept it from with an older timestamp, certainly not too old, but something like a firewall rule or configuration setting, there could be more frequent changes. So there's going to be no question there will be some real time screenshots or screen sharing that will be asked of by the assessor for certain things. So one thing that we didn't cover earlier, and I think you asked a question, and it was a two-parter, and I think we only answered the first part, was kind of evidence or documentation repository. So I think that's really important as well, to establish some centralized repository to have that evidence, right? So whether it's SharePoint or some other FedRAMP FedRAMP's cloud service provider, or a GRC tool like Aptiga. We happen to use Aptiga for our stuff, but just ensuring that you have a centralized place to store that documentation and evidence. You maintain access control measures to protect it, and then also kind of mapping that evidence back to the security control, right? So whether you identify, label it, name it accordingly. Forgive me on the rules. I know a lot of the control, certainly know most of the controls by heart, but I guess I'll pick on configuration management or something. So like 3.3.3 or something like that. If you had a screenshot of your IT change management system, or that would be named and easily identifiable for that security control. So it would be a CM 3.3.3, which is a requirement to have an IT change management process, right? So it's much easier if you've identified that artifact and named it accordingly. It's going to be a lot easier for you to find that artifact when asked for it during the assessment.
Interesting. But I've got one that just came in, and this goes back to the beginning where we put a lot of emphasis on an SSP. Somebody was asking, what are the must-haves to an SSP? What are some of the critical needs of an SSP to have to start this whole journey?
So the SSP, the must-have in the SSP are actually are the objectives of the SSP control, and you can find the SSP control in the security assessment section of the 800-171, the security assessment control family. But the must-have of the SSP are as follows. The SSP must have, a description of the system. The most important thing that is mandatory is the cage codes that the SSP covers. This SSP, the first thing is this SSP applies to the following cage codes. The reason for that is the cage code is the index by which DCMA, the Defense Contract Management Agency, manages SPRS, knows your company, and knows which contracts are under which cage codes. So if you want to make, and the CMMC EMAS is also indexed on the cage codes. So you enter the cage codes that this SSP covers, and then underneath that, they want to see, okay, who is the authorizing official, et cetera, what are the inventories, the assessment boundary, the system boundary. I'm not saying that you need to put that in the SSP, but you need to link in the SSP, link it to the appropriate inventory documents, spreadsheet reports, or whatever, and then link it to the CUI flow diagrams, the network diagrams of all the in-scope system, the CUI flow diagrams, and the system boundary diagrams. So these are all the stuff that goes at the beginning. Including the list of your vendors that are in scope, your MSPs, CSPs, etc., and the list of your third parties that receive CUI. So that includes, the prime contractors, your subcontractors, plus additional places where you are sending CUI, and then, of course, at the end, you have the implementation of all the 110 controls and the 320 objectives. People just say, 110 controls, and they forgot the 320 objectives. And then the assessor reads it, and then, so you answered objective 1, objective 2, but I don't see any language in the SSP regarding objective 3, failed. Because remember, CMMC is pass or fail, met, not met. So you miss one objective, you miss the whole control.
So, again, with all of this, it's very intensive, and I had the dare I say, honor to kind of attend an assessment on access control, and seeing on that level, just from my limited knowledge, the process of like the documentation, the artifacts, the evidence, it's a lot. They get very granular. Is it practical for, say, a smaller company to have one person that is tasked with all that to maintain it? Or do you see more success with a team approach, having dedicated individuals to kind of help on that path? What would you guys recommend on that? I'll start with you, Dariush.
So smaller companies do not have the luxury of having
Yep.
multiple people maintaining their SSBs, but they may rely on a tool to help maintain the SSB, and then remind them that, hey, we need to I need to update the SSB. The SSB is more than is getting close to the anniversary of the annual anniversary. Let me go look at the SSB. Let me do the stuff. Even the smaller company that I have assessed has usually, it was a two-person shop. It was a two-person task to maintain the CMMC environment. One person was responsible for the documentation. One person was responsible for the technical controls, and they coordinated with each other. They were part of the IT department, and it was a very small company. They had only one contract, but it was a critical contract for the Navy, and they were literally they were an extension of the Navy, because they had lots of Navy equipment within their site. But that was how they maintain CMMC, and they are still doing business, and I think they passed their CMMC level 2 with flying colors, because literally the whole company was security minded. They understood it. Whenever they had an interpretation issue, they go ask the Navy, and they go ask the thing, and they got that, and they whatever the Navy told them, they actually kept that email. The Navy told them, if you do this, you are meeting this requirement. They kept that, and they gave it to the assessor. Hey guys, this is the Navy told us to do it this way. So therefore, the assessors was going to accept that.
Right.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that, whether you're a smaller shop or a large company, as long as the duties are defined,
Correct.
it can be accomplished with some work and elbow grease.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. Well, I'll add, and obviously every company, it's different size and situation is different, but certainly there's some traditional, well, obviously there's a lot of traditional IT, but there's also some traditional HR, right? Human resources for the personal security domain, generally handled by HR. It doesn't have to be, right? Background screening, things like that. But that's generally an HR function within an organization that has HR. There's also obviously the physical protection requirements, again, could be assigned to the IT person. But if there's a building or facility manager, generally, those are roles that generally fall in their roles and responsibilities for those different types of roles. So the other thing is lots of small organizations have just completely outsourced, their IT, which is fine from their service provider will take care of the interview and the examine interview tests and stuff like that for the assessment. But there still has to be an internal CMMC compliance, person or POC identified. I think it's a requirement by the C3PO as well. So certainly someone has to be the lead for CMMC in the internal organization.
Yeah,
especially that there is a whole control family called the physical security, where the IT is not even responsible for it.
So it's also like we establish a good battle plan before we start this, to make sure all the duties are defined, and we look at our assets, what we have to bring in before we even get started. So that makes it pretty clear. Well, everybody, I want to thank you, Dariush, Bobby. We're near the end of our time. I want to thank you all both for helping out, for being on the panel. And again, if anybody of the attendees has any follow-up questions or something pops into your head at 0dark30, feel free to email them back to me. I'll be more than happy to consult with these two to find out next steps or get the answers for you. Next, if we could roll the slide forward, Dariush, if any of our attendees wanted to get hold of you, or, oh, excuse me, well, I'll back up real quick. There we go. If they wanted to get a hold of you, how would they do that? And kind of do the bottom steps there.
Yeah, so the best way to reach me is my email, which is my first name dot last name at CohnReznick.com. You can even go on our website. There is a button that you say, I need I require either a CMMC readiness consultation or a C3PAO consultation, and that's going to go and get routed to me. And others in my group, which is the Cybersecurity Tech Risk and Privacy Group at CohnReznick.
Perfect, thank you. And Alluvionic, like we alluded to in the slide before, we are a woman-owned small business, C3PA, excuse me, 8A. We have been in business for, I think, 12 or 13 years now, but we've got multiple service lines. So not only on the cybersecurity GRC side, we also have services in project management. We have a mechanical engineering and product development arm, as well as process improvement, training, and government services. So as you're progressing down this journey, you might come across something that we could maybe support you with. Feel free again to reach out. And again, any questions for Dariush or Bobby or myself, we welcome them. Feel free to email everything. Thanks everybody for attending today. Dariush, Bobby, thank you again. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There we go. Thanks, everybody.